I'm so happy to see you guys here, and I'm really happy to welcome you to the Shmita Project Northwest's second in our series called Approaching the Shmita Year. Um, I'm going to screen share for a second and show you a little bit about what the Shmita Project Northwest is. Um, The Shmita Project Northwest, first of all, we're a project of Congregation Beth Shalom and Washington Interfaith Power and Light Earth Ministry. And what our goal is we are hoping to educate, inspire, and build community around bringing Shmita values to life in the Pacific Northwest. So in the 6th year, we're going to ensure that our community is aware that there's Shmita year coming next year, has an understanding of what Shmita means, what it's all about, and feels invited to think creatively about bringing Shmita values to life in your homes, communities, your synagogues, and in the wider world. And then in the 7th year, which is next year, we hope to create, publicize, and share Shmita-related programs, activities, and initiatives throughout our region. So a really exciting part of that is welcoming people through this speaker series to a range of different topics that touch on the mosaic of Shmita values. And hopefully by gathering this wide group of people who are interested in different aspects of Shmita, and then we hope to learn together and be creative together, that this isn't a consumer mentality, but a constructive and creative, vital participatory endeavor. So without further ado, I want to introduce Nigel, who's our speaker. Nigel Savage is really exciting, and let me see, I'm gonna unshare my screen if I can figure out how to do that. Can you? Screen sharing has stopped. Oh, thank you. Great. Okay. Nigel is the founder and CEO of Hazon, which is the largest environmental organization in the American Jewish community. He started Hazon by leading a bike ride from Seattle to Washington, D.C. to raise environmental awareness in the Jewish community. And Hazon is just an incredible fountain of creativity in the fields of Jewish thought about sustainability, and also creating a generation of farmers, but that's another subject, of Jewish farmers. Nigel has twice been mentioned in the Forward 50 as people, Jews who had profound impact on our community and also throughout the nation. He was awarded an honorary doctorate for his work by the Jewish Theological Seminary, and this is what we have in common. He's been passionate about the topic of Shmita since 2007, and I'm really thrilled to invite him to carry on from here. Thanks, Nigel, for being our speaker today.
So Deirdre and Melanie and everybody, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for letting Bruce and me to join with you. I and we are incredibly excited to be with you. You should know that I had a meeting earlier this morning with a group of leaders from a shul on the East Coast who wanted some ideas from us, and we were talking about Shmita, and they came out of it all excited, saying, we're going to make this a whole theme of our shul. And I've got a meeting right after this with the head of the Jewish Federation from Major City, who wanted to talk about us with all of these things. You are, to my knowledge, the only shul that's already doing this. And you are the only shul that has the Northwest Shmita Project, and the only person like Deirdre who's doing this work. And I really want to say kol hakavod, like well done, Deirdre, personally to you, but really to the whole institution for being totally at the front edge of Jewish life. Also wanted to say personally, Seattle now turns out to have a particular place in my heart twice over. Firstly, because Hazon began in 2020 years ago. We began Hazon with a bike ride across America, and we started at at UW Hillel, University of Washington Hillel. Meanwhile, the last time I was basically allowed out in public before COVID was at the urgency of now in Seattle, whatever that was, basically slightly more than 52 weeks ago. And I think some of you were there. And we were talking about the world, and like, who could have imagined that we would go through the world that we're now in. So I'm going to say a little bit about Shmita. We're going to do a little bit of learning, a little bit of brainstorming. But before we do, this is a small enough group. I don't think I'm necessarily going to hear from everybody, but I would like to just hear from 2 or 3 people. Go ahead and demute yourselves. And I'm interested to know, like, one reason you're excited to be here now, something about Shmita as a concept that you find interesting, or a question that you have, even though I don't promise to answer it. But the floor is open for 2 or 3 people to say hello and any of those things. Tell us your name and a sentence about why you're interested to be here or interested in Shmita.
I'll talk. Am I unmuted? My name's Carrie Kessler, and I am a member of Beth Shalom. I'm also an artist. I'm very interested in how the environmental movement and how climate change intersects with Judaism. And when Deirdre started talking about Shmita, and it just has really resonated with me. And a lot of that is in my work. So I'm just curious about, I'm just following this path. And so I'm intrigued for the conversation.
Thank you. Somebody else, tell us your name and why you're interested in this, or a question you've got.
Nigel, this is Kevin. I have a question. What are the obligations of Jews during the Shemitah year? How are those obligations different in Israel and outside Israel?
Thank you. And we can take one more.
I can offer one that's kind of off the wall. I'm Mike O'Neill. I am Christian, but I'm also Native American heritage, and I've just discovered Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, and I have a whole lot of questions about other ways of looking at the land and our relationship to it. And then last week, I was privileged to join Rabbi Ellen Bernstein in her discussion about the promise of the land. And when she started talking about the words of the Seder that relate to land, it gave me a resonance, a common point that we share going back to Deuteronomy that I want to learn more about.
So thank you for that. All 3 of you are in the right place. And let me give a very brief comment, if I may, to the 3 of you, and then I'm going to go forward. First of all, Carrie, let me say to you, you didn't know this, and we haven't announced this, but in 2 days' time, we are announcing the Shmita Prizes. Everything else in Jewish life has a ritual. You light Shabbat candles, Hanukkah candles, there is a Seder plate, and there is no ritual for Shmita. So we're announcing prizes in 5 categories for artists in relationship to Shmita. And we're going to invite a prize for a ritual object, for something that's fine art, for film and video, for liturgy, and also for those of you who don't think of yourselves as artists in the category of written word, for essays and big ideas. So you're the first Jewish artist that we've told publicly this is happening. You've got a 48-hour head start. Kevin, to you, I want to say that it's a particularly great question, and it leads on to what we're doing today, because halachically, in a traditional religious context, Shmita has force and has power in the land of Israel. If you're a religiously observant Jew, and the Shmita year is coming up, which it is, and it starts this Rosh Hashanah on September the 6th this year, and you're in Israel, there are to this day particular things that you can and can't do, and vegetables that you can and can't eat. But if, like all of us here, I think you don't live in the land of Israel, none of the provisions of Shmita are binding upon us. And so that to me is interesting, because it doesn't mean we don't do anything, right? The temple was destroyed, so none of the sacrifices can be brought there, but we learn all sorts of things in the Torah, and they reflect who we are today. And so your question to me leads into the wider question of, well, okay, but what do these texts say? And what can, could, or should they mean for us today? And finally, Mike, And I'm going to ask Bruce from somewhere to find a link to this. This was a book that we did 7 years ago. Rav Kook was the first chief rabbi of modern Israel in the early 20th century. And in the year 1907, he wrote a book called Shabbat Haaretz, Shabbat of the Land. And most of the book was explaining how you could circumvent the rules of Shemitah, a kind of supersized version of selling your Passover breadcrumbs in order for like a modern economy to flourish. But in the introduction to the book, he wrote an extraordinary essay about how central Shemitah is as an idea and how beautiful and how important. It had never been translated into English. So we translated it into English, and I wrote an introduction. And in the introduction, I started off saying, who is this for? And I said, well, it's for religious Jews, it's for non-religious Jews, it's for environmentalists. And I also, Mike, and wrote, this is for you. And that's why this book is intended for you also, if you're a thoughtful Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or of any other faith tradition. The role of religion is up for grabs on this planet right now. People have begun this century by murdering in the name of religion, just as in centuries gone by. Yet those who do so are in a tiny minority of people of faith. And so we want the Jewish tradition of Shemitah to become an opportunity to learn and share among religious traditions of all sorts. And I went on, what would a Tibetan Buddhist make of Shemitah? How does a Native American read Rav Kook? What would be a Sufi commentary on Rabbi Sinclair's introduction? We hope in due course some of those conversations will unfold. So you're all in the right place. So let's do a little bit of learning about Shemitah, and then we're going to brainstorm what it means for us today. So I'm going to do a screen share. And for those of you who want to download this or print this, it is, you should be able to print this. And I'm so techie. Can you see a piece of paper that says Biblical Foundations at the top of it? Anybody? Can you see this? No.
No, we're seeing your Google Drive.
You're seeing my Google Drive. Okay, that's not good. How about now? Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay. So I just wanted to start off with this. Although we talk about Shemitah, one of the things that's kind of fascinating is in the Torah, it's described in different ways and they use different words. And part of what's to me so fascinating about Shemitah is this is not something that exactly tells us what to do or not do. It's a whole set of teachings that, in my view, provoke us and challenge us to think about who we are, how we live, what it means to be Jewish in the 21st century, and frankly, what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. So I'm just going to run through these, and then we're going to look at one of them. So in Exodus, and later on in Leviticus, it's described as Shavuot, just the 7th. It's like the 7th year, just like Shabbat is the 7th day. Then in Exodus, you have this phrase, Tishmatena and Matashta, like let things go. Then you have the notion of Shabbat Ladonai. It's a Shabbat for God. What does that mean, by the way? Does God need a Shabbat? Then you have Shabbat Shabbaton. It's a Shabbat of Shabbats. What does that mean? Clearly, Shabbat is a time of rest. What would a Shabbat of Shabbats look like in our lives? Then you have Shabbat Haaretz, a Shabbat for the land. Somehow or other, it's about the land resting. And then only at the very end, in the book of Deuteronomy and Dvarim, do you have this word Shemitah, which means to let go. Now, if we had time and we have a Shmita source book, and I should have introduced earlier on, you'll have a chance to hear from him, but I'm with my colleague Bruce Spearer, who runs the Shmita Project at Hazon, and I'm going to ask him to put some links in the chat and stuff. But these things are from our Shmita source book, which we're revising at the moment, but sections of this are online, and I'll ask Bruce to send you a link to it. So we're going to look right now at just one of these references. And this is from Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. And I don't quite know how big this screen is, but can somebody start to read for us here in the English?
I'll do it. The Lord spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, the land is to cease, a Sabbath ceasing to the Lord. For 6 years you are to sow your field, for 6 years you are to prune your vineyard, and then you are to gather in its produce. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of Sabbath ceasing for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. Your field you are not to sow, your vineyard you are not to prune. The aftergrowth of your harvest you are not to harvest. The grapes of your consecrated vines you are not to amass. A Sabbath of Sabbath ceasing shall there be for the land."
And just stop there for 1 second. Thoughts and comments on this so far? Do you get it? Do you like it? Do you agree with it? What questions do you have? Thoughts and comments?
Could I ask a question, Nigel?
Yeah.
This is something that I've wondered about. You know, after the 6 days of creation, there's a Sabbath, and that's essentially it's the first day of the human being's existence is Shabbat. And I wonder, when I read this, I see for 6 years you are to, when you enter the land is to cease. Is the first Shemitah the first year in the land, or is it the 7th year in the land?
Yeah, it's totally not clear. I want to say very clearly that so much of what I love about this is not clear. That's a big question. What is the relationship between the notion of Shabbat as a day and Shabbat of the land for a year? Not clear. There are certain things that we don't do in a day, but how would you not do them for a year? There's a bigger question that's raised by this, by the way. What are you meant to eat? Just skim read those words again, right? Hang on a minute. I'm God, the divine, whatever. For 6 years, work hard, sow your field, prune your vineyard, gather its produce. But the 7th year is a Shabbaton for the land, a Shabbat for God. Don't sow your field. Don't prune your vineyard. The aftergrowth of your harvest, we're going to come back to this, by the way, don't harvest. The grapes don't amass. Shabbat shall there be for the land. Well, that's fabulous. What am I meant to eat? Other thoughts and comments? And I want to say also, I want to really tease and provoke you today. I want to open up why I'm so excited by this. I promise you we could spend 100 hours doing this and we wouldn't get bored. Any other, and my point is we could spend an hour just on this text, but I'm going to keep us moving. Other thoughts and comments on this?
Oh, I guess the other 6 years, we need to be putting something aside in a warehouse.
Aha.
Yeah, Joseph showed us the way.
Aha. So one of the things that is great about that, I want to say to everybody for real, this is how I want to immediately make this bridge. And going back to Kevin's question at the start. I make no presumption about anybody's religious observance in the screen right now. But to the extent that you're in this meeting, you're interested in Jewish tradition or religion or spirituality. And Northwest Shmita Project is a part of a shul synagogue. All of Jewish life runs on the Jewish calendar. Tuesday is different from Shabbat. Hanukkah is different from Purim. Passover Seder is different from Rosh Hashanah. Only piece of Jewish life, certainly in the United States, where institutional Jewish life doesn't register the calendar, is the Shmita year. And I think it should, and I think that we should. And going back to Kevin's question, there is nothing that we have to do. But going back, Mike, to what you said, part of what is significant about Shabbat, somebody doesn't wake up at 6:30 on a Friday afternoon and be like, oh, let's get Friday, Shabbat dinner ready. People in pre-COVID times, at least, would be like on Tuesday evening, oh, what are we going to have for Friday night dinner? Are we going to eat with friends? What are we going to have for Kiddush? And in a similar fashion, one of the meta questions for all of us is, oh, okay, the Shmita year is going to be starting this September the 6th. How is this going to be different for the shul? And how is it going to be different for me personally and for my family? I'm going to give you one example now that exactly, Mike, goes back to what you said. And I'm going to give you a second one later on. 7 years ago, in the lead up to the Shmita year in 2014-15, which was the last Shmita year, I was all excited about it. I was teaching about it somewhere. And as I was talking about it, in my own head, I was thinking, Nigel, this is great, super. But how is the Shmita year going to be different for you? I was talking about institutions and our farming program and so on. Very randomly, I thought, you know what? I'm just not going to buy a book for the Shmita year. Now, as addictions go, buying books isn't a terribly bad one, but I've of course got an apartment full of books. I like books. It's a very Jewish thing to buy books. And it was so stressful to me, this notion of not buying a book for the year, that starting in April, which is to say 6 months before the Shmita year started, I'm hoping that's going to go away. Starting in April, I started going around the shelves in our apartment and taking books off the shelf that I either hadn't read or I had read, but I wanted to read again. And I wrapped them in newspaper and didn't mark what the name of the book was. And my idea was, I'm going to try and not buy a book for the whole of the Shmita year. And if suddenly I can't bear it, I'm going to take one of these books, unwrap it and go, oh my God, I always wanted to read this book. So first of all, let me ask you 2 questions. Firstly, did you think I succeeded or not in going the whole year without buying a single book? Who thinks I did succeed and who thinks I did succeed? And who thinks I didn't? So the answer is I didn't buy a single book. And how many of the books, I had over 100 of them wrapped, how many of them do you think I opened? Right, so the answer is 0. I didn't buy a single book. I didn't open a single one. It turned out I had more than enough books, plus the New York Times and the New Yorker and God knows what else. You didn't need to buy a book for a year. That's, Mike, how it goes back to your question and how I say this to everybody. As we think about what the values of Shmita may imply, the question is then, what does this mean for me and for us? Okay, let's keep going. Somebody just read us this last paragraph here.
Now the Sabbath yield of the land is for you, for eating, for you, for your servant, and for your handmaid, and for your hired hand, and for your resident settler who sojourn with you, and for your domestic animal and the wild beast that are in your land shall be all its produce to eat.
So there's something going on here. There's something that we're not allowed to do, and there was something that we are, and it's totally not clear. So now we're going to skip 1,000 years, and now we're going to Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi is the French Ashkenazi Jewish commentator from the 11th, 12th, 13th century. I'm revealing my momentary ignorance. We'll Google that. And he goes to this phrase in the middle. Here, where are we? In the 5th line. Can't see it. Da, 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 da. It's Tzviach Ketzircha lo tiktzor, right? The aftergrowth of your harvest, don't harvest. It's this strange phrase, and I'm not a farmer. And the question that Rashi's trying to get at is, what does this mean? This aftergrowth, don't harvest it. So 1,000 years later, he says, what does it mean, the aftergrowth of your harvest you shouldn't reap? With the intention of taking possession and ownership of it like other harvests. Rather, it shall be hefka, ownerless, for all to take freely. Hefka is actually a central religious concept in Jewish tradition. He's explaining this phrase, the aftergrowth. When he says don't take the aftergrowth in the primary text, when he says what does it mean, he's saying what it means is, instead of treating this harvest, this is my land. It's my land and it's my harvest in normal years. I eat it, I sell it, I give it away, it's mine. Rashi is saying, what does that line mean? It means in the 7th year, it's not yours. The other 6th year, it's yours. The 7th year, it's hefka, it's ownerless. And in Jewish religious law, like literally, if it's ownerless, then there are no obligations on it, anybody can take it. I was looking at this text just recently, and a friend of mine in Jerusalem who's religious said that he had gone to pick up his kids at the end of the school year. He's a rabbi, and the nursery school teacher, had all of this detritus at the end of the year, stuff that the kids had left behind and bags and clothes and stuff. And the teacher said to him, "Rabbi, can I treat this stuff as hefker?" Meaning, if it's not hefker, I'm under a religious obligation to figure out whose this is and return it to them. But if it's hefker, then it doesn't belong to everybody. I can just donate it to the local, homeless shelter. That's what hefker means. Here's then what, and so somebody then read this next paragraph. Let it go, hold on a minute. Read this further thing that he says. And the produce of the land shall be yours to eat. It's the next line. Somebody read what Rashi says.
Although I have prohibited the produce of the Shemitah year to you, I did not prohibit you from eating it or deriving benefit from it, only that you should not treat it as its owner. Rather, all should have equal rights to the produce of the 7th year, you, your hired worker, and those who reside with you.
Thoughts and comments?
I was expecting him to mean that some stranger could walk into the field and harvest.
That's exactly what he means. That's exactly what he means. And by the way, it's consonant with two other provisions of biblical law called laket and payah. Payah is the corner, and it's the provision that says you should leave the corner of your field unharvested. Question, how much is a corner? We don't know. Is it 1 square yard? Is it 1,000 square yards? Unclear. But there is something that you're meant to leave for poor people to take. And leket is stuff that falls off trees. Also, it's and the idea is that we have a modern sophisticated welfare economy, COVID, bills that go through Congress, PPP checks and so on. This is the Torah inscribing balances. This is the Torah saying there is inequality in society. How do we reduce it? Once every 7 years, we say that stuff that's yours, it's not yours. Anybody can help themselves to it. And whereas in a sense, yeah, go on.
Oh, Nigel, I wanted to, since you're answering Mike, and he's also a recent person who read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. In my mind, there's a really beautiful connection between these ideas that Nigel just raised, this Paya and Leket, and her passage where she talks about how the indigenous people of the upper Great Plains would leave the rice. It was beyond their capacity to imagine why anyone would try to take all the rice. That the rice is meant to fall into the water. It's meant to feed the ducks. It's meant to be there. And that there's nobody's interest is actually served by taking the last one. And so when I read this, I was very delighted to find that in my tradition, there was this concept of leaving behind, because it occurred to me after reading that stuff that's left in the field, not only is it going to feed the hungry human being, it's certainly also going to feed the hungry deer and the hungry ants and the hungry insects when it's left behind. So that's a beautiful connection that I noticed.
And I would go further, by the way. I would say absolutely straightforwardly, this is not how we think of it if we grew up in Seattle or Washington or Manchester in England. We entered human history as an indigenous people. And the Torah is a record of the Jewish people entering human history as an indigenous people, with a relationship to land, language, life cycle, climate, food. And we've traveled through all these countries, all these centuries, all these languages. It's the same Sefer Torah we take out in the most extreme ultra-Orthodox synagogue, in the most liberal Reform or Renewal temple. And it's the same Torah. And it's a record of entering history as an indigenous people. Hazon does a bike ride in Israel every year. And many years, the first day we ride from Jerusalem to Ashkelon, it's not that far. It's about 40, 45 miles. It's a comfortable day's bike ride. You go through all these different ecosystems. A friend of mine pointed out, in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, there are Shivat Haminim, there are 7 species that are named as indigenous to the land of Israel. And a friend of mine one day on the bike ride pointed out that in the course of a relatively short bike ride from Jerusalem to Ashkelon, we passed all 7 of them growing. right? That's what it means that we entered human history as an indigenous people. Let's do one more bit, and then we're going to bring this totally back to now. So this is the Rambam. This is now Maimonides, living in Cairo, writing both in Hebrew and in Arabic. Here's what he says, also explaining this. It's a commandment to divest oneself from everything the land produces in the 7th year. As it says, in the 7th year, you should leave it untended and unharvested. Anybody who locks their vineyard or fences off their agricultural field in the Shmita year has nullified a positive commandment. You broke the law. This also holds true if they gathered all of the produce into their home. Instead, they should leave everything ownerless, hefka. Thus, everybody, rich and poor, has equal rights in every place, as it says in the Torah, and the poor of your people shall partake of it. One may only bring a small amount of produce into one's home, just as one brings from ownerless property. Now, and I want to, how do I end the screen share for the moment? Or how do we just maximize our view of each other? Can we do that? Just make yourself look at each other and not at the script. I don't think of this as a stick to beat us with. Jewish tradition is not radically anarchic. He doesn't literally say, make yourself penniless, give everything away. But that said, it's kind of intense. And I'm really interested to brainstorm. And this could be tiny. But if in the coming year, you wanted, influenced by this, to sort of let go of things in some way, to treat certain things as hefker, as ownerless, what might that be? What might you do? What might be hard about that? What might be exciting about that? And by the way, this is not just you as an individual. I'm going to say, for those of you who are members of Bat Shalom, this applies also to the synagogue as an institution. Is there anything the synagogue could do? Thoughts and comments. There's definitely no correct answer to this.
Well, Nigel, one idea that I have that I love is just the idea of planting our gardens around, because we, like, for instance, Beth Shalom has a food garden, a big food garden. Just a second. Beth Shalom has a big food garden, and one of the things, and many of us have gardens in our homes, and it seems like if we were to plan our gardens this year for the summer, because we still have a 6th year, I think that we're allowed to continue planting. Maybe it's up until Shavuot, prior to the Shmita year, and then put, like, right now there are little free libraries for books everywhere, which are this beautiful sort of hefker books. Imagine if we had hefker produce, where, like, I might put up a stand for my plums, and other people might come by and they would swap a bag of plums for a bag of zucchini, and we could have like a neighborhood of little free garden farm stands, for instance.
I farm commercially. I grow cherries in Eastern Washington, and it would just seem to be so much better if the Shmita could rotate by owner. To have all the Shmita in a single year just seems very impractical.
So let me say to both of those, what's your name, farmer in Eastern Washington?
Dana.
Dana. So first of all, one of the things that's lovely about this, going back to the original response to Kevin, I think, is that, again, none of us has to do anything. So it's a really interesting thing, if you're a farmer and you're in relationship with your other farmers, to bring all the farmers together and say, it's a crazy time in America and we're coming out of COVID. There have been tremendous challenges. People have lost their jobs. I'm fascinated by the Jewish tradition of Shmita, which, by the way, is in the same Bible that's a Christian Bible. And there's a notion of doing such and such. I'm not sure if it's feasible for all of us to do this the 7th year, but I'm kind of interested to go first. And I'm going to have some of my cherries be available for people in need, or I'm going to give more of them to a local homeless shelter. And I'm going to do this year. And I want to invite 6 of you to each pick a different year in the next 7 years and have you do that. And as much as on the one hand, you could say to everybody, oh, it's the Shmita year, let's do it. I think that's part of what is amazing about this moment in the world and in Jewish history. We're on the one hand heir to the tradition, and it's legitimate for us to love it, engage with it, lean into it, and learn from it. And on the other hand, if we want to interpret it in a slightly different way, that's fabulous. Deirdre, going back to what you said, and Melanie, I say this to you, and going also to Shmita as a frame to think about, I'd like to see, I have no idea how much land your shul has. And I'm so ignorant, I don't really know what kind of fruit or nut trees you could plant there and what grows in Washington State. And I'm just an English Jew who lives in New York. I'm useless. But let's assume that there is something or other, apple trees, right, that could grow on your land. I think it would be amazing if you don't already have them to plant apple trees. And in September of 2029, September of 2028, at the start of the next Shmita year, mail shot all of the neighbors, put a physical note through the door of every neighboring house and say, this is the sabbatical year in Jewish life, this is the Shmita year, please come and help yourself to the apples. This is the opposite of like, stay off our land. It's like, we can sit at these hefka, and anybody here wants to come and help yourself to an apple anytime in the next year, other thoughts and comments? How might you interpret this for you at home, in your family, place of work? What comes immediately to mind? What would be challenging?
The idea you had for farmers, I think, would actually work. Most of the other farmers I've met tend to be very devout Christians and to be very sincere in their beliefs. And I bet, the problem is a lot of the farms now are owned by large corporations, but I bet a majority of privately owned farmers would probably be interested in doing that. It's a great idea.
I'm going to put my email in the chat, and anybody should feel free to follow up. If you do something like that, let us know. I'm going to put.
And I'm going to cut in too and say, first, let us know. We get primacy, but since you're in the Northwest, Dana, but I'd love to have. I'm definitely planning to reach out to farmers, and you're number one on my list. Sorry, Nigel.
Not at all. Absolutely. Yeah, and Phyllis, but whoever that is, but just demute yourselves. Far away.
Yeah, I'm an urban person. I live in the East Coast, and I'm thinking I'm not going to be able to produce enough farm this year, let alone enough to save. But I'm thinking the idea of not wasting and not overbuying would make sense to all urban people. So when I go to a place like BJ's or something of this nature, I tend to overstock and then I don't have to go back for quite a while. But maybe just being more conservative, and especially this past year, I've been overstocking because I hate going into stores. So I'm not buying. I'm shopping less, but it's just the idea of clothing, food, paper, whatever that you don't need to buy, you don't buy.
Yes, and one of the things that's so obviously we haven't had a chance to look at all these different texts about Shmita, but one of the things that I think is really fascinating about it is that part of this is, I think, about concern for others. I think some of this is about reducing inequalities. It's about providing things for people who are poor. There's all of that. That's one thing. But also within this is, I think, something about ourselves and how we relate to things and how we relate to stuff. And that's sort of what you're saying. And I think it's really right. So I said to you earlier on that one of the things I did last time around was decide not to buy any books, and I did. And I said, but there was a second thing I did, and I'm going to tell you later. So I'm going to tell you now, because it relates to what you just said. A little bit later, after I decided not to buy any books, and I think actually this was already when the Shmita year was beginning, I decided not to buy any liquor. Now, just to be clear, this was not a huge self-prohibition. I wasn't banning wine. I wasn't banning beer. I wasn't banning myself from drinking anybody else's liquor. I just kind of randomly decided I wasn't going to buy any liquor. Partly I liked the idea of limiting something else. Partly I liked the idea that liquor is from a grain, and some of this is about harvesting grains. And I don't drink so much scotch, but I drink a certain amount of scotch, and I like scotch. I have a few bottles of scotch. If people would come over, I would offer them a scotch. It started to be fascinating. Shmita year starts in September, and as the year goes on, my stocks of scotch are starting to go down. And I'm starting to wonder if this is going to be a Hanukkah miracle or not. Never mind, is the oil going to last for the year? Is the scotch going to last for the year? Not just is the scotch going to last for the year, but how am I going to relate to it? Am I suddenly going to stop offering scotch to people because suddenly I'm like, I want it for myself? And I was perfectly aware, again, Kevin, going back to your original question, that on the one hand, that there's no place in the Torah that it says, if you're a liberal Jew living in America in the 21st century, you mustn't buy bottles of scotch for the 12 months of the Shemitah year, right? Clearly not. But I was kind of fascinated. Oh, and I should say, and I offer this to you as well, I should say that one of the reasons that I decided both not to buy books and not to buy scotch, I felt very clear that I wanted to do something that seemed to me to be in the spirit of Shemitah that would cause me to remember that it was the Shemitah year. It didn't say that before, but I actually think it's significant. If we have this thing that's kind of not incumbent on us and life goes on and nobody in Jewish life really observes it, then how do we remember? And to me, it's kind of an amazing piece of the tradition. So I wanted to pick things that would cause me to remember that it was Shemitah, forget anybody else. Well, you'll be pleased to know that this is a happy story. It's even a miracle story, because without asking or anything, in one brief 4-week period of time, 4 different people happened to give me bottles of scotch as a gift. I think a bottle of scotch is not a normal gift. People come for a meal, they might give you a bottle of wine. We got 4 bottles of scotch, and lo and behold, my scotch lasted for the whole year. It didn't run out. I'm down to my last 5 minutes. I think you're going to stay online for 10 minutes after I leave. I'm going to say a couple of things, and then I think I just want to invite a few people, including people who haven't spoken, just share us like one thing that you've enjoyed or you're thinking about or you're provoked by. For me, let me simply say, go to hazon.org. If you want to be on our mailing list, we won't inundate you, but you can put down, your email and stuff. If you want information on Shmita, go to Shmita Project. That also includes stuff about the Shmita Prizes, which is going live later in the week. And most of all, I want to say seriously, Deirdre Gabay is an amazing human being. Northwest Shmita Project is an incredible project, and you all should be incredibly proud of her, and you should support what she is doing about 1,000,000,000%. With that, I want to hear from a few people. Thoughts, comments, ideas, things you're thinking about.